Okay, let's just dive right in. To really get Hegel, you have to place yourself in his time. We're talking about one of the most intellectually charged and just politically violent eras in modern history.
Absolutely. The late 18th, early 19th centuries. This isn't some abstract, quiet period of reflection.
No, not at all. He's living through the American and French revolutions. He sees the terror. He's watching the Napoleonic Wars literally redraw the map of Europe. Crowns are just toppling left and right.
It was an age where philosophical theory was just forced, really, to confront this raw, catastrophic reality. I mean, to any observer, history must have looked like sheer, unadulterated madness.
Just the cycle of destruction.
A cycle of destruction, suffering, upheaval. And Hegel, born in 1770, sees all this brutality firsthand. He gets it. He recognizes that this spectacle could easily lead to a kind of intellectual despair.
Yeah, and he has a name for it. He famously calls history a slaughter bench.
The slaughter bench of human sacrifice. It's such a powerful image, and it captures that feeling of hopelessness perfectly.
It really resonates, even today, when you look at periods of intense global conflict. The natural human reaction is just to ask, is there any point to all this suffering?
Right. Is there a pattern, a destination? Or is it just, as you said, one tragedy after another signifying nothing?
And that is the exact question that Hegel sets out to answer in this monumental work, The Introduction to the Philosophy of History.
Our mission in this deep dive is to try and grasp the colossal theoretical structure he built. He's trying to argue that this seeming chaos, the slaughter bench,
It's actually rational.
is in fact the necessary, rational, and this is key, knowable unfolding of order. He isn't just seeking to explain history, he's seeking to justify it.
And that justification hinges on the big claim, the one that requires a real intellectual commitment from you, the listener. It's his core presupposition.
Reason rules the world.
It's a philosophical commitment of the highest order.
And it's so crucial to understand how sweeping this claim is. He treats it in two distinct yet complementary ways. First, you have to see it as an initial assumption.
An a priori starting point, as philosophers would say.
Exactly. Before you even crack open a history book, you have to have this intellectual faith that history is rational, that its trajectory is fundamentally logical.
So you're arriving at the archives already armed with this certainty that there's an ultimate pattern there to be found.
Precisely. But then there's the second part of the claim. He says, reason rules the world because history itself demonstrates it. It's also an ultimate conclusion.
And a posteriori finding.
Right. History, when you view it correctly through this philosophical lens, reveals that your initial faith was justified all along. This duality is critical. It forces the philosophic historian to look for the ultimate order, knowing it must be there.
Which kind of guarantees the success of the project from the get-go.
In a way, yes. So we aren't just searching for a pattern, we are confirming the necessary divine pattern that we already knew had to exist. It gives his method a certainty that he argues previous forms of history lacked.
Okay, so to guide us through this very intricate argument, we need to get a handle on the central Hegelian concepts. We'll have to unpack the driving force he calls spirit.
That's the translation for the German term Geist. We'll mostly stick to spirit, to keep it clear, but it's important to remember that Geist implies more than just a soul or a mind. It's a collective, unifying consciousness.
Consciousness that unfolds over time.
Yes. And we'll also look at the role of individual passion, human will, the messy, seemingly chaotic element.
And then finally, how spirit manages to use that chaos for its own lofty, rational goals.
Through this startling and sometimes frankly alarming mechanism he calls the cunning of reason, or in the original German, Die List der Vernunft.
So before Hegel can really introduce his own method of philosophic history, he feels the need to establish why all the previous methods just fall short.
He does. He clears the field, so to speak. He sets up this really rigorous taxonomy of historical writing, showing how other approaches fail to capture the true why of history.
They miss the underlying rational structure.
They miss the structure. And the way he classifies them suggests a kind of progression in human consciousness about history itself. You move from simple description to profound philosophical reflection. He gives us three major categories: original, reflective, and then his own philosophic history.
Let's start with the first one then, original history.
Okay, so original history. This is the history written by someone who is completely immersed in the events they're documenting. They are, as he puts it, sharing the spirit of the times.
So the key here is immediacy.
Immediacy, that's the perfect word for it. The historian lives within the era they're writing about. They share the culture, the consciousness, the whole political outlook of that moment.
And their job, their primary task, is just to translate what they see, this external reality, into a mental representation.
Exactly. Through writing, they're recording the moment as it's unfolding around them.
We're talking about the big figures of the classical age, right? People like Thucydides.
Thucydides, yes, chronicling the Peloponnesian War almost as a participant observer. Or Herodotus, documenting the Persian Wars. Their writing is immediate, it's visceral, and it's tied directly to their personal experience.
Hegel even says that the speeches they attribute to historical figures, which might seem like moments of reflection,
are not. He argues they're effective actions in their very essence. They're integral parts of the events themselves, not some kind of objective, after-the-fact analysis.
So the strength of this original history is its vital connection to what's happening.
Yes, but that's also its profound limitation. Because the historian shares the Geist, the spirit of the age, they are limited to creating a portrait of the time. They can't rise above it.
They can't transcend or reflect deeply on the era because they are living inside of it.
They capture the what with incredible clarity, but they are philosophically blocked from grasping the universal objective principle that's driving that moment. Original history is a primary source, not an ultimate philosophical insight.
It's like being a single cell in a massive organism.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
You can perfectly describe your immediate environment, the pressures, the threats, what's required of you, but you can't describe the whole body's circulation system.
Or its ultimate destiny. No, original history just doesn't have the necessary critical distance to do that.
Okay, which brings us to the next, more sophisticated category he outlines. Reflective history. This method, presumably, takes a step back.
It does. Reflective history is written after the period has passed. This gives the historian that analytical distance that's necessary for interpretation, for analysis.
So the historian's own time, their own philosophical framework, starts to inform the narrative.
Exactly. They're no longer bound by the spirit of the period they're writing about. They're not just documenting reality anymore. They're creating a coherent narrative about that reality. And Hegel breaks this down even further into 4 subtypes.
Okay, let's start with the first one. Universal history. This is the big picture stuff.
Right, this is where a historian tries to account for the entire history of a people, or maybe even the whole world, tracking a single thread of development.
But the scope is just immense.
Immense. Trying to cover thousands of years in one volume means you have to condense. You have to compress these incredibly complex events into simple, generalized statements.
So the raw material of history becomes too vast to handle without a heavy editorial hand.
And in doing that, Hegel observes the historian's own thought, their own organizational framework, becomes the main feature of the work. They become the mightiest epitomist, imposing a predetermined structure, coherence over these huge stretches of time that probably didn't feel very coherent to the people living through them.
The structure is the reflection, not the events themselves.
Precisely.
Okay, so after trying to encompass the whole world, we get to historians who are looking for something more practical. He calls this pragmatic history.
Yes, and this is history written with a very explicit agenda. It's seeking to draw parallels between past events and present situations, often to provide political or so-called moral lessons.
And this is where Hegel delivers that famous, really brutal dismissal.
He does. Nations and governments have never learned anything from history. It's just complete rejection of the idea.
Why is he so skeptical?
For him, history unfolds because the spirit changes. The problems of the past are fundamentally different from the problems of the present because the state of human self-consciousness has advanced. So any moral lesson you derive from the past, well, he says that pale memory has no force against the vitality and freedom of the present.
That immediately challenges our modern assumption that the primary reason to study history is to learn not to repeat mistakes.
It does. For Hegel, if you're looking for practical lessons, you're fundamentally misunderstanding what history is for. You're reducing the sublime unfolding of spirit to just a set of classroom maxims.
It's just ideological framing, not real philosophical insight.
Exactly. So moving on from history that tries to teach morality, Hegel turns his critical eye inward. He looks at historians who focus on critical history.
Which is basically the history of history.
Essentially, yes. This approach is all about reinterpreting existing accounts, scrutinizing their accuracy, challenging documents, posing alternative narratives.
That sounds like a very modern academic pursuit, challenging the established facts.
Yeah.
Why did Hegel have a problem with this?
He believed it risked replacing objective historical reality with subjective intellectual gymnastics. He saw it as putting subjective notions in place of facts.
So it's more about being clever than being truthful.
It becomes a way to extort new things to say from existing narratives, just for the sake of novelty, rather than engaging with the true reality of the spirit's unfolding. It prioritizes the analysis of documents, the historian's cleverness, over the objective process of history.
It's too focused on the process of writing, rather than the process of the world.
Precisely. And that brings us to the final subtype, which is specialized history.
Okay.
This is where a historian focuses on one thread, say the history of law or the history of art or religion, and this is a really crucial transitional category for him.
Why is it transitional?
Because by focusing on a single universal concept, the idea of law through time, rather than just King so-and-so's legal decisions, the historian is finally introducing a universal concept as the guiding rationale.
So this sounds almost philosophical. Specialized history, it's getting close, is recognizing that there's an underlying guiding idea.
It is, but it only applies that idea to one specific thread, not to the whole tapestry of world history. It sees the universal within a specific part of spirit's creation, but not the universal idea that governs everything. It's a necessary intellectual warm-up for the final step.
And this brings us finally to Hegel's own method, philosophic history, which is supposed to transcend everything that came before. What's the fundamental difference?
The commitment to the a priori. It prioritizes philosophical thought over mere events or subjective interpretations. The core ideas, the nature of reason, the nature of freedom, they come first and can stand alone.
So you don't derive the principle from the facts, which is the weakness of reflective history.
No, you bring the principle to the facts.
The philosopher shows up with the answer already in hand. Reason rules. This is where that a priori certainty we talked about becomes the actual methodological lens.
That's it. While critical history works a posteriori from the facts to maybe a conclusion, philosophic history works the other way around. It imposes the philosophical necessity of reason onto the empirical data.
And once you have that powerful, non-negotiable guiding principle, the whole focus shifts. It's not about individual events anymore.
It's not about who did what and when.
So what is it about instead?
It's about looking at the larger non-temporal process, the process by which the eternal spirit unfolds itself in the world as temporal history. You're studying the essence of spirit first, its inherent definition as freedom, and then you're observing its inevitable and necessary realization on the world stage.
He's setting up his system to study not just what happened, but the very mechanism of self-realization that drives everything.
Which makes history not just a study of facts, but a pursuit of absolute necessary knowledge.
Okay, so having established that philosophic history is guided by this a priori thought, we have to really dig into the character of that thought. Reason. When Hegel says reason rules the world, it sounds abstract, but he gives this concept immense world-shaping power.
He has to. It has to be sufficient to guide the entirety of history. And we need to see reason as far more than just human logic. For him, it's the absolute foundational metaphysical reality.
Let's break down the three primary characteristics he assigns to it. First, reason is the substance.
Yes, it's the essential underlying content of world history. All reality comes to be by virtue of reason. Its nature is nothing outside of reason itself. It is both the blueprint and the material.
So every event, every institution, every law
is fundamentally built upon rational structures, whether the people involved realize it or not. Reason is the core material, the DNA of existence.
So it doesn't just describe reality, it is the foundation of reality.
Okay.
What about its second characteristic? It's power.
Reason is infinite power. It's not just some passive, abstract concept you contemplate. It is actualizing. It is constantly seeking to bring itself into external manifestation, to realize its own concepts in the concrete world.
So it's the engine, not just the roadmap.
Exactly. This power is what ensures that history isn't arbitrary or chaotic. It's a necessary, forceful process of reason realizing its own intrinsic laws out there in the world.
And finally, the third characteristic, reason is infinite content.
This is a crucial point about its self-sufficiency. Reason needs nothing outside of itself to create. It is the only material on which it works. It's its own justification, its own goal, and its own material.
So because it's self-generating and depends on nothing external, it's infinitely free.
Utterly free, bound only by its own laws and its own conclusions, it is a completely self-sustaining system.
So Hegel is defining reason in terms that are powerful, self-sustaining, the substance of everything. I mean, he's basically using terms that traditionally sound divine.
They do, and this inevitably raises the question of how his philosophy connects to existing religious concepts of a cosmic order.
He has to address them.
He has to. He's forced to address existing ideas about a transcendent reason ruling the world, particularly the religious model of divine providence.
So why does he see that traditional religious model of divine providence as incomplete? I mean, it seems to share the same premise, that there's an overarching rational plan.
The problem with the religious view, Hegel argues, is that God's plan remains hidden. It's unknowable. The faithful can accept it on belief, but they don't have any intellectual access to it.
It's a mystery.
It's a mystery accessible only through faith, not through intellect. And Hegel sees this as deficient. It fails to adequately explain the connection between that transcendent principle and its effects in the concrete world, especially when you're dealing with the problem of evil and suffering.
He also briefly takes on the Greek model, right? Anaxagoras.
Yes, who proposed that nature operates on unchangeable rational laws. But Anaxagoras' nous, his concept of mind or reason, that only dealt with immutable physical laws, the interaction of elements.
It wasn't about human society.
No, he wasn't talking about conceptual human self-reflective reason. He failed to see the world, including human society, as an organic whole brought forth by reason. Both Anaxagoras and the common view of providence fail to show how abstract reason becomes concrete, self-conscious reality in the realm of human action.
And Hegel's project is explicitly designed to fill that massive intellectual gap. He actually calls his project a theodicy.
He does. It is a justification of the ways of God. But unlike traditional theology, Hegel is asserting that God's plan is reason, and that reason is knowable through philosophy. History, therefore, becomes the process through which that plan is fulfilled, revealed, and intellectually understood.
So we are meant to gain the insight that whatever was intended by the eternal wisdom has come to fulfillment in the events of history.
Right. If God has revealed himself in the world and in history, as Christian theology asserts, then it's our highest intellectual duty to know that revelation fully. And that means understanding the rationality of history.
By replacing the unknowable divine will with knowable rational spirit, he completely shifts the purpose of historical study.
The goal becomes the recognition of that positive aspect, in which the negative disappears as something subordinate and overcome. In other words, only by seeing the rational progress can we get past the tragedy of the slaughter bench view of history.
The suffering isn't meaningless.
It's a necessary step in this divine rational realization.
So if reason is this powerful, self-sufficient substance, we move from the abstract idea of reason to the active concept, the self-conscious idea, or spirit, that actually interacts with the messy human world.
And everything we study in history, all intelligence and self-conscious will, is subject to this active self-conscious idea. The idea is the summarized, active version of spirit that directly informs the universal principles governing humanity.
So human thought, human action, they aren't subject to chance or arbitrary choice.
No. They're ultimately governed by this unfolding rational framework.
That sounds, well, almost deterministic. Does Hegel leave any room for real deviation or randomness in history?
Not in the macro sense, no. The universal abstract power of reason must, by its very nature, realize itself externally. If reason has infinite power, it can't just remain a potentiality.
And it does this through the human mind.
Through the human mind, leading to the creation of universal systems and institutions, specifically the state, history is this inevitable unfolding. Every subjective choice, every particular event, it eventually gets swept up and used by the overarching objective necessity of the idea.
Okay, so if reason is the substance of history, then spirit, or Geist, is the central concept that unifies reason, freedom, and self-consciousness as they actually appear in the world.
Yes. Spirit is fundamentally the process of reason realizing itself. It's the active historical manifestation that drives change.
Let's start by getting a clear definition of its core essence. He contrasts it sharply with something simpler, like matter.
Right. Matter, according to Hegel, is defined by its dependence on an external force, like gravity. It's always seeking something external to complete itself. It's inherently fragmented.
But spirit is the opposite.
Spirit is defined by self-sufficiency. It has its center in itself. It is entirely unified and depends only on its own internal principle, and that principle is freedom.
So freedom is the only truth of spirit. But this isn't a casual, arbitrary freedom like the ability to do whatever you want.
No, this is rational freedom, total self-sufficiency, and that requires being grounded in self-conscious knowledge.
Spirit has to know itself to be free.
Exactly. Freedom necessitates self-consciousness, the union of that I know and what I know. Spirit knows that it knows itself, which unites it as a subject with itself as an object. It's a closed, self-referential, and entirely dynamic system.
Okay, but if spirit is this unified, perfect concept in the abstract, why does it need history at all? This is where that famous seed metaphor comes in, right?
It is. Spirit, as an abstract concept, is like a seed. It contains everything it will become, potentially. All the complexities, all the stages of freedom, all the eventual rational states are packed inside it. But potentiality is not actuality.
For that freedom to become real, concrete, it has to be planted in the world.
It has to be actualized externally through human history. It needs to realize itself objectively in institutions and societies to be able to fully know its own freedom subjectively.
So the history we see is just the mechanism of the seed growing into the tree.
A painful, lengthy, and necessary mechanism, yes.
And this realization, this growth, happens over millennia. Hegel charts world history as this long process of making the abstract concept of freedom a concrete reality. He's tracking humanity's increasing awareness of freedom.
That awareness is the key. The whole thing is a progression of self-consciousness regarding freedom. He outlines 3 main stages or epochs of world history based on how many people understood themselves to be free. This is really the heart of his historical structure.
The first stage is the Orient, the earliest, most primitive stage of this self-consciousness. Here, only one is free.
Right. These societies, which he associates with empires like China or Persia, they operated under a centralized despotism, an arbitrary rule. There was unity, a universal principle holding society together, but the masses were not aware of their inherent freedom.
And their institutions didn't reflect it.
Not at all. And since they did not know they were free, Hegel argues, they were in fact not free in any rational sense. Their institutions were based on arbitrary authority, on fear, on habit, not on rational law.
Okay, so from the one, we move to the second stage, the Greeks and Romans, the classical world. In this phase, some are free.
This is a massive qualitative leap forward. These civilizations developed the first true social consciousness of freedom. They gave us concepts like citizenship, universal law, especially in Rome, and democratic participation in Greece.
But it wasn't universal.
No. Freedom remained tied to arbitrary conditions, like chance of birth, class, or land ownership. They failed to see freedom as a universal human characteristic. It was a privilege, not a right. The existence of slavery, for example, fundamentally contradicted the idea of universal freedom.
And then we get to the final, highest stage, which Hegel identifies with his own time and culture.
This he associates with the Germanic world, which is fundamentally informed by Christianity. This is the stage where the realization finally dawns. All humans are fundamentally free.
Not because of their birth or class or wealth,
but because they are human subjects animated by spirit. Christianity, he argues, by asserting that God revealed himself to all men, laid the theological groundwork for universal human freedom. This was later translated into secular political terms through the Enlightenment and, ideally, the modern state.
So the recognition of universal rational freedom is the ultimate goal.
It's the goal toward which all of history strives. But of course, recognizing freedom conceptually is radically different from actualizing it in the chaotic, concrete world of political reality.
Absolutely. And that transition from the abstract concept of freedom to its concrete reality in the world, that is history itself.
That's the entire engine of history. The final goal of the world, Hegel asserts, is the maximization of spirit's consciousness of its freedom, and hence also the actualization of that very freedom.
We've established that this transition is history. Is this a smooth, voluntary process? Or is it compelled?
It is an infinite necessity, and it happens through struggle, through the dialectic. Spirit must externalize itself. It has to become objective in the state, in law, in culture, in order to know itself subjectively. This movement from potentiality to actuality is the necessary work of history.
And why is that externalization so difficult?
Because the concept of freedom, which is infinite, must manifest itself in finite forms, in specific laws, specific institutions, specific moral codes, and these specific forms are, by their very definition, limited.
So spirit has to struggle against its own limits.
Against its own negation. to attain a higher, richer, more complete form of realization. The very nature of freedom compels this constant, often painful self-overcoming. Freedom, he says, contains the infinite necessity of bringing itself to consciousness, and thereby to reality.
So it's a constant philosophical struggle made manifest through political revolution and conflict.
It is. The world stage is where the infinite concept of freedom battles the finite, imperfect institutional forms it creates. And this is what ensures history is always moving, always negating the current state in favor of the next higher stage of rational realization.
So we know what spirit is and we know where it's going. Now we have to address the central practical question of how it gets there. We're shifting from the pure idea to the human element, the means spirit uses.
And these means are entirely external to the pure idea. They are human needs, drives, passions, and interests. In the grand scheme of history, things like subjective morality or personal virtue, they're often insignificant compared to the sheer driving force of human ambition and desire.
Let's focus on passion. We need to define it beyond just simple emotion.
For Hegel, passion is the subjective will when it completely occupies an individual. It's not a fleeting thing. It's the person's encompassing goal, the cause that defines their life's work.
So people commit to a purpose empire building, political reform, whatever it is, only if they find their own sense of self-satisfied in it.
Yes. This passionate commitment, this dedication to subjective self-fulfillment is the raw, burning fuel of historical activity.
So when people pursue their own selfish interests, fame, wealth, ideological purity with total unwavering dedication, that is the kinetic energy that moves history forward.
And this subjective will, he says, commands an infinite right to be fulfilled. Now, this creates a crucial tension point.
Right. How can the chaotic, subjective pursuit of personal glory serve the orderly, objective plan of reason?
Hegel insists that history unfolds precisely because this subjective realm of human passion is joined to universal principles. World history is immediately determined by this confluence of the universal idea and particular human passion.
And their intersection creates the state.
The ethical freedom of the state is built by the ruthless energy of human passion, but it's built according to the abstract, necessary idea of rational freedom.
This brings us to maybe the most striking and frankly chilling concept in the whole thing, the cunning of reason.
Die List der Vernunft. Yes. It explains how this universal idea uses the destructive, chaotic energy of individual passions to achieve its objective, rational ends.
The phrase itself suggests a kind of intellectual trickery. How does it work?
Well, reason, being infinitely universal and objective, it stands aloof. It's untouched by the messiness of subjective struggle. Yet, it orchestrates events by setting finite subjective human passions, like Napoleon's ambition for empire, against each other.
And these passions are intensely committed to their own finite aims.
But they are, entirely unknowingly, doing the heavy lifting for reason's overarching, rational, universal aims. They are the unwitting tools. They expend their finite energy, they suffer the consequences, while reason conserves its universality and achieves its higher goal.
He uses an analogy, doesn't he? The house analogy.
He does. When you build a house, you use elements like fire, water, and wood according to their nature. But those elements are used for a higher purpose, the house, that ultimately limits those very same elements. It protects you from the fire and the water.
So human passions are used in the same way.
Similarly, human passions, ambition, greed, cruelty are used according to their nature to achieve a particular subjective result. But in achieving that result, they involuntarily construct the next rational stage of the state, the house.
But wait, if reason uses finite humans like tools, doesn't that inherently reduce their infinite right that you mentioned? How can reason be truly rational if its method is so ruthlessly utilitarian, just burning through individuals for the universal goal?
And that is the tragic paradox inherent in Hegel's system. Individual humans serve their own interests, but they also serve a larger purpose that may well destroy them or turn against their original goals. Reason delegates the burden of execution and risk to passion, standing back while the tools exhaust themselves building the universal structure.
This method, while, I guess, ruthlessly efficient from a philosophical perspective, is why history looks so cruel.
It is why it is a slaughter bench.
We have to come back to that. The cunning of reason implies that all this destruction and suffering, the revolutions, the wars, the tyrants, are necessary sacrifices for progress. If the end is ultimate rational freedom, then surely the means are justified.
That is the temptation of pure philosophic thought. But Hegel pulls back a little. Even while arguing these tragedies serve a higher purpose, he insists we cannot approve of a single death. The subjective side of human experience, the suffering, the insight, he argues it has an infinite right to be satisfied because of the share of reason they possess.
So reason uses them as means, but they remain ends in themselves. That seems impossible to reconcile.
It creates an irreducible tension. Humans are valuable ends in themselves because they share in the essence of spirit. Their individual consciousness is sacred. So the philosopher has to recognize the rational necessity of the conflict while simultaneously recognizing the moral tragedy of the loss.
The universal principle is realized through the particular, but the destruction of any particular life is still a loss of something divine.
Because the human subject is animated by spirit.
Yes. So the philosopher has to adopt two perspectives at once. The objective, seeing the rational necessity, and the subjective, recognizing the infinite right of individual will. The tragedy of history comes from these two constantly being in conflict.
And yet it's only through this destructive conflict that progress occurs. This is the ultimate burden of the rational historian.
So to really understand this cunning of reason, we need to focus on the individuals who embody this powerful subjective passion, but who unknowingly act as the spearhead of the universal idea.
The world historical individuals. These are figures like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Martin Luther, Napoleon.
And these figures are monumental because their personal passions, ambition, a desire for glory, ideological conviction, they happen to partially coincide with the objective will of the world spirit.
They're not just great leaders, they're historical agents. They are instrumental because they are like lightning rods for what the time intrinsically demands, even if they aren't fully conscious of that demand themselves.
Their personal greatness is that they seize upon an idea that's just ripe for actualization.
An idea that the collective spirit of the people, the Volksgeist, is unconsciously demanding.
So they seem to know, just instinctively, what the next step must be for their society, but without knowing why it's the next step in the development of spirit.
Exactly. They lead because they articulate a passion that others immediately recognize as necessary. They articulate the next necessary move in the universal idea. They bring the unconscious spirit of the people to consciousness.
The people are vaguely thinking it, the institutions are demanding it.
But the hero provides the focus, the decisive action, and the concrete form for that idea.
You could take Napoleon, for instance. His ambition to conquer Europe, it wasn't just personal tyranny. His actions inadvertently fulfilled the historical necessity of spreading the ideals of the French Revolution universal law, rational administration across a continent still stuck in feudal forms.
He destroyed old structures, unintentionally making way for the next stage of rational freedom.
Or Caesar.
Caesar is a perfect example. His personal ambition to become emperor seemed purely self-serving, yet it coincided with the historical necessity for the Roman Republic to transition into an imperial state, a state capable of administering universal law and citizenship across a massive multicultural territory. His subjective goal served the objective need.
So their sole purpose is to foster the emergence of the universal from the particular. They bring in the major systemic changes that the time demands, often raising a new concept of the state out of the chaos of the old system.
That is their function.
Okay, but since these figures are driven by this enormous, all-consuming passion, often ruthless, self-serving, brutal, they're frequently morally questionable by conventional standards. How does philosophic history deal with their tyranny or their cruelty?
Philosophic history has to look past those subjective moral problems. It's concerned only with the actions of the spirit of peoples, not the personal quirks, the vices, or even the ethical shortcomings of their leaders. The historical actor's personal motivation is, in the end, irrelevant to the objective historical outcome.
That seems incredibly cold. I mean, you look at Napoleon's death count or the political purges required to establish a new order, and Hegel is telling us to ignore that because we're being spiteful. How are we supposed to overcome that natural moral revulsion?
He argues that focusing intensely on their personal defects is often just envy or spiteful musings. It's a common human tendency to want to reduce monumental figures to our own limited moral scale, rather than recognizing that their function transcends personal ethics.
The philosopher has to look past the individual subjective morality.
Recognizing that personal ethics are often arbitrary unless they're linked to the universal principles embodied in the state.
In other words, their moral scorecard is secondary to their function as the necessary midwife of the new rational order.
Exactly. The ultimate purpose of these individuals transcends their lifespan and their personal virtue. They are agents of historical necessity. And once their task is complete, once they've established the next rational stage, they are often cast aside.
Their work is absorbed by the growing rational apparatus of the state.
And they often die unhappy or violently because they are no longer needed. Their actions have to be seen as part of the overall progress toward the concept of freedom, not judged solely on subjective personal morality.
So if the world historical individual is the agent of spirit, then the state is the ultimate destination. It's the material form of the rational goal of spirit. And Hegel gives the state this almost impossibly high metaphysical status.
He does. It's the ethical totality. It's the form that abstract spirit takes in actuality. The state is the necessary union between the idea, the universal principle of rational freedom and human interests or passion, the particular subjective wills of individuals.
It's the concrete material through which spirit realizes itself. This sounds way more encompassing than just a government.
Oh, it is. The state is where the objective idea of freedom becomes a lived, factual reality. It provides the framework, the laws, the social structures that allow an individual's subjective freedom to coexist with the objective necessity of the universal.
This concept is incredibly counterintuitive for anyone familiar with, say, liberal political philosophy, which tends to view the state as a necessary evil, a social contract that limits our natural freedom for the sake of order.
And Hegel flicks this completely. He is radically emphatic about this. The state does not limit true freedom. It is the condition for true freedom, for rational freedom.
That's what does it limit?
It only limits caprice, arbitrary subjective will, the impulsive, fleeting, unthinking desire.
So caprice is not freedom. True freedom, in the Hegelian sense, only exists when an individual's choice adheres to universal rational laws that the individual recognizes as their own.
And without the state, there is no universal law. There's no concept of individuality beyond the arbitrary rule of the strongest family unit. And consequently, there's no true history or self-consciousness.
The state allows people to see their own collective rational spirit in an external, objective form,
which enables both self-consciousness and, crucially, true freedom. Submission to rational law is liberation from arbitrary whim.
This elevates the state far above just a governing body. It is the culmination of the divine idea on earth.
Hegel's superlative claim is indeed that the state is the divine idea as it exists on earth, the thing in which freedom gains its objectivity. It provides the only possibility for universal rational freedom, where the subjective needs of its people ideally coincide with the rational laws that govern them.
Making the individual's duties and rights perfectly aligned.
In the ideal state, yes.
Okay, so because the Hegelian state has to be this perfect instantiation of the union between subjective and objective will, he rejects models that fail to achieve this. Let's revisit his rejection of the patriarchal model first.
The patriarchal model sees the state as just an expansion of family-based authority, where justice rests solely with the patriarch or the chieftain. Hegel sees this as transitional and inherently arbitrary.
The authority is based on personal loyalty, not law.
Personal loyalty and custom, not on a universal rational law that applies equally to all. Its statehood would be nothing more than a theocracy or an extension of the family that limits freedom by subjective authority, not objective reason. It fails to evolve.
So the subjective will of the leader is too prominent. Next, he rejects the majority rules model, which sounds a lot like modern democracy.
He dismisses pure majority rule as simply the rule of subjective will, the collective caprice of the moment with no autonomous grounding in an objective universal principle.
If every decision requires a constant vote of every citizen,
the universal principle is never truly embodied in an authoritative, objective sense. The state needs trained intelligence, objective law, and real established authority to ensure the universal idea is upheld, rather than being swayed by the momentary whims or the arbitrary passions of the majority.
The objective freedom of the universal idea must stand independent of subjective popular consent, even though it must also contain it.
It's a very fine balance. So the ideal state needs systems that are rationally self-justifying, not just historically or popularly justified.
And it's vital to remember that when Hegel talks about the state, he means the entire culture of a nation, the whole ethical totality, not just the government bureaucracy.
The state encompasses the whole spiritual reality of a people, including their highest intellectual pursuits.
Right. Religion, art, and philosophy. He calls them configurations of spirit that reflect the universal consciousness of that specific historical stage.
Yes. Religion, for example, is where the spirit becomes aware of the absolute form of spirit as God and provides the ultimate ethical justification for the state's principles. Art tries to make the absolute visible through aesthetic representation. These forms reflect the Volksgeist, the unique national spirit at that moment.
But philosophy is the highest expression of the state's consciousness.
Absolutely. Philosophy is the highest, freest, and wisest form of self-consciousness. It tries to know the absolute idea in and of itself. It provides the ultimate medium through which a people and spirit itself can come to know themselves in their universal dimension.
So the state is the actualized form of the idea.
And philosophy is the consciousness of that idea. The state is the realization of freedom, and philosophy is the realization of self-consciousness, the two sides of spirit unified in the life of a rational people.
Okay, we now turn from the stable, perfect concept of the state to the turbulent process of change, the actual course of world history. We have to start by establishing why history is qualitatively different from nature.
The difference lies in the process of development. Nature is essentially cyclical. It brings forth new forms of the same essential content. A tree grows, dies, new ones grow from its seeds. But nothing fundamentally new emerges in terms of principle or concept. It's repetition.
History, on the other hand, involves true development. It actualizes a drive toward perfectibility and the emergence of fundamental new concepts.
Specifically, the concepts of greater freedom and self-consciousness. Spirit realizes itself through consciousness and will, human characteristics, not through some quiet natural process. The state of the ancient Greeks is not just a repetition of the earlier Orient, it's a qualitatively higher stage of self-awareness.
And this progression is not a smooth, linear growth.
No, it happens through intense struggle and destruction, the dialectic. And the struggle is one of self-negation.
Can you describe how spirit progresses through this internal struggle?
Spirit posits determinations in itself, then negates them, and thereby gains an affirmative, richer, and more concrete determination.
Okay, let's break that down.
Spirit, being freedom, has to manifest itself in a finite, specific state form. That specific form is the positive, the thesis. But because it's specific and finite, it's inherently limited. It contains its own internal contradiction, the antithesis.
So spirit then has to negate that contradiction and synthesize a new, higher, more inclusive concept of freedom, the synthesis.
Exactly. The state is perfected, but its very perfection, its very definition, sets the stage for its eventual conflict and decline. The abstract universal principle of the state contains its own limits, its own negative.
So why does a seemingly perfected state, the realization of spirit at that stage, inevitably decline and fall?
Well, once it's perfected, the state becomes static. It's a matter of habit and custom. The universal principle it runs on has been fully actualized and formalized. Life becomes comfortable, and the self-conscious revolutionary activity of spirit is no longer needed in that specific form.
It becomes stagnant.
And stagnation is death to the restless energy of spirit. But the root cause is deeper than just comfort. It's a philosophical necessity. Any abstract category, any universal principle defining a state, carries its negative within it. For instance, the freedom achieved by the Roman Empire, defined by universal law, contained the internal negation of spiritual emptiness and alienation,
which was eventually filled by the subjective, personal consciousness of Christianity.
The solution to one stage's problem becomes the problem of the next.
This often results in what Hegel calls national suicide. The state destroys itself because it's outlived its historical necessity,
often through internal strife or overwhelming external conquest. But this destruction is not failure, it is self-overcoming. The old state must be destroyed, negated to arise in a new, transfigured and exalted form. It builds on the past stage, incorporating its rational freedom but solving its inherent limitations, rather than just repeating it.
This constant movement, this self-estrangement and eventual self-overcoming is the necessary driving force of history.
It is.
Let's conclude this segment with a final detailed analogy that really encapsulates this cycle of perfection and necessary decline. The seed, the tree, and the poison fruit.
Right. So spirit is the seed. It contains all the potential and the universal code of freedom. It develops into the state, which is the tree. And that tree yields the rewards, the fruit that the people crave.
This is the golden age of that specific national spirit, the Volksgeist. The moment where subjective needs coincide most closely with the universal principle.
The fruit is the culmination of that particular state's rational existence. But once it's ripe, the fruit eventually becomes poison to the system. The very perfection of the universal principle breeds its own negation.
How does that happen?
Once freedom is achieved and institutionalized, the people stop striving and they fall into habit. Or they begin to demand a new kind of self-consciousness that the old perfected structure can no longer provide.
So the old state falls apart.
But the fruit yields new seeds and new trees, new states, new Volksgeister that build on and transcend the one that has passed away. This destruction is a necessary rebirth, not a meaningless collapse.
So what does all this mean for us, the philosophic historians, studying this massive temporal sequence of destruction and rebirth?
Hegel offers a final point of comfort. While history appears as a temporal succession of stages, philosophy can study the eternal, universal spirit itself, the absolute idea which remains ever present.
So all stages are co-present in the idea, even though they manifest sequentially in time.
In a sense, philosophic history is concerned only with an eternal present. Although we study the movement of spirit in time, we have to remember that the entire temporal course is only an unfolding of the one constant: spirit, the self-realization of rational freedom.
We started this deep dive acknowledging the chaos and brutality of history, the slaughter bench that seemed to defy any meaning and mocked any notion of purpose. We journeyed through Hegel's colossal theoretical structure, and we found the rational guidance of spirit.
We witnessed spirit's operation through the messy reality of human passion. We saw how it achieved its objective goals through that startling and ruthless mechanism of the cunning of reason. We saw the state not as a mere government limiting freedom, but as the ethical totality, the material realization of the divine idea on earth.
And finally, we tracked history's turbulent dialectical course, the necessary rise, the perfection, and the self-negation of a state. The conflict and the violence are the inevitable result of the universal struggling to realize itself through finite subjective agents.
The intellectual payoff for you, the learner, is the ability to interpret political upheaval and social change, not as random failures of human morality, but as rational, determined progress toward a greater self-conscious freedom. Hegel provides a monumental framework for finding necessity, even in the worst catastrophes.
But if Hegel claims that every state, every ethical totality must eventually suffer national suicide because its perfected principle contains its own negative, leading to rebirth in an improved form,
then we must ask ourselves, what element of rational universal freedom is our current ethical totality failing to realize? What fundamental internal contradiction is inherent in the way we currently organize freedom?
and what necessary dialectical negation is already looming on the horizon?
What poison fruit are we currently consuming, unaware that its perfection will necessitate our transformation?
Something to mull over until our next deep dive into the underlying necessity of the world.